So look, welcome everybody. A relatively small group tonight, but I think this is just a fascinating topic. Yep, here we go. Heather's coming in. Absolutely fascinating topic to consider. It comes from a book that was shared with me by a friend. This is going back several months ago. I ordered it intending to look at it for holiday reading. In the end, the company I ordered it from went bust and I didn't get it. So anyway, I got to read the book eventually. And it's just really very, very interesting subject to consider alongside of Swedenborg's work. So that's what I'm intending to do. What I'll do to start off with, though, is just mention next year. This is obviously our last meeting for the year. Next year we'll be meeting again last Friday of each month. But we're going to do a little bit of a change. So one of the things that we have done, or we've set up recently, is what's called the Swedenborg Social Media Network. And I'm intending to invite a number of social media creators in the Swedenborg space to come and talk to us. It'll be in an interview style, myself and them on camera. It'll be online on YouTube for those who want to join online, but we will also have opportunity for people to meet here face to face and be able to throw in questions, on the floor, and we'll monitor the chat and that sort of thing as well. So that's what I'm intending to do in the coming year. And our first guest will be on the 28th of February, and that will be Howard Thompson from the Roseville Church in Sydney will be joining us. Don't know what the subject is at the moment, but it'll be opportunity to introduce Howard and what he does, particularly on YouTube with a thing called Spiritual Shorts. So that's in the year ahead to look forward to. As always, if you're on our mailing list, you'll get a notification of that, sometime a few weeks before the event actually happens. So today is Julian Jaynes and Emanuel Swedenborg. It's a journey through the bicameral mind. And I want to start by saying that as we set Jaynes alongside of Swedenborg, my impression of him, and I've already been corrected about this tonight, is that we are looking at a very materialistic philosophy. And so that's something that I want you to hold in mind. The material's taken from really three sources. The first is the book you can see on your right there, God's Voices in the Bicameral Mind, and I have my own copy here with me today. This is published by the Julian Jaynes Society, and it's a collection of essays by a number of different authors. Often they describe Jaynes' philosophy briefly before they launch into their own take on it. So as you read that book, you get Jaynes' philosophy repeated over and over several times. So, which is useful, but it also means that you end up with a lot of the same material, so they're really reinforcing the same sorts of things. And I'm going to do the same tonight. So then the book on the left is Julian Jaynes' original book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And the third source that I'm going to mention is this little video with Dr. Brian McVeigh. He is one of the authors in the book God's Voices in the Bicameral Mind. And he has this rather interesting little interview that he is conducted on YouTube with these two puppets called Quinn and Mickey. They are allegedly alien humanologists. So it's quite interesting having someone talking about the bicameral mind and being interviewed by puppets doing it. I think it's an irony that is not lost on Brian. But a very, very good interview, and I've got a snippet of it to show you at the end of tonight because I think it raises a really interesting question. It's on YouTube, yeah. So anybody who wants that, I can provide the link for you later on. Now, I'm going to start with a question, and feel free to unmute and make a comment. What is consciousness? If you were asked to define consciousness, what would you say it is?
Well, consciousness is something that happens whenever a body appears, whether it's a human body, body of an ant, body of an antlife, It always appears whenever a body appears. Prior to the appearance of the body, there is no consciousness. So
Okay.
what consciousness, where consciousness is, it's on the background. What is the background? Background is pure awareness. There's nothing in it. It's a state of absolute pristine eternity. When a body appears, pure awareness is obliterated and consciousness takes its place.
Okay. Thank you.
All right?
Michael, I can see you've unmuted. You wanted to say something?
Right, going with the root meaning of the word, con means with, and consciousness is related to scientia, to know. So it's a knowing in totality. So it's a higher level of knowing compared to awareness.
Okay.
And it's seeing things in a togetherness, which is something that we don't normally experience in our human existence. It's a special state of enlightenment.
Okay. Thank you. Heather?
I really haven't got anything to add now because the two guys have actually said what
They've
what
said
I
it all?
thought
No,
anyway. Yeah.
That's fine. Okay, it's just a question worth thinking about because Jaynes has a very particular definition of what consciousness is. So just hold the question in mind. Now, here's another one. Which of these requires consciousness to happen? So I've got 6 things here. Reactivity, I mean the ability to react to external circumstances. Reasoning, I think we understand the mental processes of reasoning. Pain, and so what I'm talking about here when I say pain is the idea of suffering. Cognition, also another mental process. Is that required? Does that require consciousness? Guilt. Do we require consciousness to feel guilt? And do we require consciousness to experience a memory? What do you think your answers are to those?
My
Anybody?
answer is you need all of them.
So it's whether you need consciousness for those things to occur is the question, rather
Yes.
than yes, you need consciousness for all of them. Okay.
Mm.
Anybody else? Any thoughts?
None of them.
None of them. Okay.
You don't need conscious for anything.
Well, I see that awareness allows us to have all of those 6 things,
Mm-hmm.
and yet there's a distinction between awareness and consciousness, and I'd see consciousness as underpinning awareness. So
Okay.
if consciousness disappeared, then awareness would disappear. We wouldn't have it, and therefore we wouldn't experience reactivity or any of the other things mentioned. So I'm seeing it both.
Oh, it's a two-way street.
Yeah, yes, that's right. So
Okay.
if there wasn't any consciousness, then you couldn't do any of those things. But
Okay.
in a sense, you can have those things with awareness, but awareness is a lower level of energy, of life mind energy, that doesn't allow you to really see things in a togetherness that consciousness can.
Okay. All right. I'm going to give you Jaynes's answer. Reactivity. No. Reactivity does not require consciousness to occur. Okay, with the ability to react to circumstances. You think about the hammer test on your knee, your reflexes. Okay, as an example. Reasoning, no, does not require consciousness to happen, according to Jaynes. Pain, and specifically suffering, yes, according to Jaynes, which is quite interesting. Cognition? No. Guilt? Yes. Guilt requires consciousness, according to Jaynes, in order to take place. And memory? No. So, just one little quote to just share with you. An activity which would otherwise take place with consciousness can, when consciousness is absorbed in something else, simultaneously occur below the threshold of consciousness. So the two examples I'll give you, one is quite common, you'll all have experienced driving somewhere and getting to your destination and not remembering your journey. Somehow you have managed to drive safely from point A to point B, but when you got to point B, you have not recalled any details of the journey. We've all had an experience like that. My particular example, so as a pianist and playing the piano for ballet exams for some 15 or 16 years, on occasion, I had the experience of, these are pieces of music I'm very, very familiar with, and on occasion I'll be sitting in a ballet exam at the piano, playing a piece of music, and my mind will wander. It will go off in some other direction. And then suddenly I'll realise where I actually am and what I'm actually doing. And I learnt that if I didn't panic at that moment, I could continue quite successfully. But if I panicked, my consciousness would interfere with what I was doing at the time, and the piece I would fall apart. Okay, and that was just a really very interesting experience I had on a number of occasions. All right, so let's get into Jaynes' view of...
Well, I see that as evil spirits doing that to you.
What was that, sorry?
I see that strictly as evil spirits doing that to you. They lead your mind astray, so you lose your concentration. So they want you to embarrass yourself.
Yeah. Well, so you're getting into Swedenborg, which which fair enough.
Which is
I'll put aside for a moment, if I may, and we'll because I want to talk about Jaynes and Swedenborg together and how they compare. So just hang on to that thought, I would say. So Julian Jaynes' definition of consciousness. So Jaynes defines consciousness as the human ability to introspect and not merely being awake or aware of one's surroundings. Okay, so that's from the book, The God's Voices in the Bicameral Mind. This next one is by Jaynes himself. And I'll just say any quote that I've put OC is from the Origin of Consciousness book by Jaynes. So he writes that consciousness is an analogue of what is called the real world. It is built up with a vocabulary or lexical field whose terms are all metaphors or analogues of behaviour in the physical world. Its reality is of the same order as mathematics. It allows us to shortcut behavioural processes and arrive at more adequate decisions, and it is intimately bound up with volition and decision. So that's his basic definition of what consciousness is. Now I'm going to go on to Brian McVeigh's work, and this is 7 traits of consciousness. Jaynes has 5 and McVeigh adds 2 more, and you'll notice them as we go through. So this is the traits of consciousness. The first one is the spatialization of psyche. In other words, imputing an imaginary space or intracosm within the individual. So for example, we talk about the inner self. And that sense of in is actually a physical thing. It's a physical concept, but we talk about it on an entirely different level. The second one is privileging individual traits. So highlighting individuation and personal uniqueness. And you can see the asterisk indicates that that's Brian McVeigh's addition to this list. The third is autonomy. That is assigning intentionality and responsibility to the inner person. The third is called self-reflexivity, and he talks about the relationship between what he calls an analogue I and a metaphor me. An analogue I and a metaphor me. It's quite difficult to get a handle on what the difference is, but you might be able to help me, Martin, at some point. But my sense of it is you have the observing person, and you have the thing you imagine yourself to be, as two quite distinct individuals within the psyche. Okay, so he says the analog I is a self-conscious entity that could conceal or dissemble to others and to itself, whereas the metaphor me is what I imagine myself to be. That's my understanding of these terms. So self-reflexivity. Then the idea of narratization, which is constructing a linear temporality with the self as the main actor. It's putting ourselves in a story. We tell ourselves a story about, how I got to where I am now, from where I've been, and where I'm going. We put ourselves in a narrative, a story. And then excerption, which is the extraction from a collection of possible attentions to a thing which comprises our knowledge of it. In other words, we are surrounded by so much sensual information. What is it that I pick out to use to construct my sense of reality? Okay, that's excerption. And what goes along with it is called conciliation. And that is the process by which a slightly ambiguous perceived object is made to conform to some previously learned schema, an automatic process sometimes called assimilation. So in other words, we observe something, but we already believe something about that thing. And what we do with our observations is seek to combine them with what we've already learnt about that object. And what we already believe has a significant impact upon our observations. So that's what happens with this excerption and the conciliation. These are quite important processes to bear in mind. And one of the things the book says is the mind's eye is not the real I. Interiorized experience of something is not perception of it. Okay? So we create a mental construct of a thing, and our mental construct is quite important in determining what we see about it. Martin, what did you want to say?
So two things that I'm not quite sure where they fit into that list. I think they do, but two things that I think about a lot with consciousness is, one, the ability to see yourself thinking, the ability to examine yourself thinking. So you get the sense that you're somehow in the background, but you're observing what you are doing as if from the outside. The second one that I get is, that I got from reading particularly, it comes out in the book, is that when someone says something about in the world, that they say, like for example, they say, oh, the other day we went to the beach. And they have a picture, a metaphor, if you like, that comes into their mind when they say the beach. Maybe they're thinking about the sand, maybe they're thinking about the wave, maybe they're thinking about the trees. And when we do this about everything, we assign an image, particularly if it's somewhere we've been, and we think about that image when we mention that we've been, but someone else we're telling to may not have been there, but they will still have an image in their mind. So we have, in a sense, artificially assigned images to every word we can ever use, except maybe words we've never heard before. But every word, every place we've ever thought about going to or been to or something else, even if you dive into the water and start swimming, it's interesting that you don't feel the water cold compressing in on you. What you tend to do is you tend to assign an image of yourself swimming. So it's as if, once again, you're looking at yourself doing something. So these are two things that really have struck home to me.
And we'll get into some of that sort of idea. So I just want to say, consciousness for Jaynes is a product of language development, an artifact of man's symbolic universe. It's bound up with language. So he says a consciousness is built up through metaphor, relationships between two or more unlike experiences joined by likenesses. Something of what you're talking about. Okay, so that's...
Anyone else want to make any comments?
I'm going to move on quickly because otherwise we'll spend forever on this, and we could, because it's a fascinating subject, but I want to move on. So that's consciousness in James' estimation, and hopefully you've got an idea of what he's talking about. It's consciousness. But we then move on to what he calls the bicameral mind, and this is the title of the book, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. So bicameral means two-chambered. And so we have here a picture of Julian Jaynes himself holding the brain, and you can see, and we can all see very clearly, the two halves, the two hemispheres of the brain. This is what he says about the bicameral mind. For the most part, a bicameral mind would operate as ours does. But when something unexpected and hence stressful happened, instead of a period of intense consciousness with inner deliberation and argument, bicameral man would receive a godlike command from his right hemisphere instructing him to act. Now go on. This is Jaynes himself. The presence of voices which had to be obeyed were the absolute prerequisite to the conscious stage of mind in which it is the self that is responsible and can debate within itself. And again, Julian Jaynes, further on in the book, the gods were in no sense figments of the imagination of anyone, they were man's volition. They occupied his nervous system, probably his right hemisphere, and from stores of admonitory and perceptive experience, transmuted this experience into articulated speech, which told man what to do. So you've got this picture of the two halves of the brain speaking to each other, and particularly the right half of the brain speaking to the left, and that's being perceived as a voice. So he talks about the origin of these voices in the right-hand side of the brain. So again, from God's voices in the bicameral mind. The address of the brain, he suggests, is responsible for these auditory hallucinations is an area in the right hemisphere that corresponds to Wernicke's speech area in the left. Since its function is not known, it has been referred to as a silent area. And he mentions the work of Wilder Penfield. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Penfield. Penfield did a great deal of work. There's a thing called Penfield's homunculus, which is the little man, and basically he maps the areas of the brain, and as you map it geographically, it comes out as the picture of a person. Okay? But one of the things that Wilder Penfield did was to stimulate this area of the brain which was regarded as silent, and they didn't know what the function of it was because it didn't seem to do anything. Most functions that we enjoy seem to have corresponding left and right sides, aspects to the brain. They involve both sides of the brain. But not so speech, apparently. Speech is entirely located in the left, and this right-hand side seemed to have no function. What Penfield did was to stimulate it electrically and discovered that people were hearing voices by this stimulation that was taking place. So then Jaynes has taken this idea and suggested that the bicameral mind worked in this way, that the silent area of the brain on the right hemisphere speaks to the left hemisphere where those words are perceived. And the thing that you have to hang on to here, and remember here too, is that according to Jaynes, bicameral man was not conscious. Okay? So I'm going to go through Jaynes' account of history. So he talks about a pre-bicameral era. So this is hunter-gatherer stage, if you like. Mankind living in small family groups. You know, they're hunting, gathering, there's no agriculture, that sort of thing going on. From around 200,000 BC. And then he notes at around 40,000 BC, they're still in this bicameral era, but there's suddenly a proliferation of paintings are being discovered. There is various tools, more intricate tools are being developed in this time. Talking about sewing needles and barbed harpoons, for example. Whereas in the earlier period, between 200,000 and 40,000 BC, the tools that were being used were much more like the tools that, say, a chimpanzee or an ape would use. Okay, much more similar to those. So 40,000 BC seems to be a watershed. Something big has happened here. Mankind has changed quite significantly. Then he talks about around 9,000 BC is the arising of the bicameral man. And basically this occurs because we start to get a larger population. People are forced into a smaller area. They're having to interact with people on a more regular basis than they've been used to. So stresses start to come into the environment which people have to start to deal with. And they're unfamiliar with how to deal with those stresses. So the process by which that occurs is the right-hand side of the brain gives instruction to the left-hand side whenever whenever something stressful comes into the environment that needs to be dealt with. So from 9,000 BC. And then from 2,500 BC, we see a decline in the bicameral mind. Something is fundamentally changing here. Now, what I will say about this date is it is highly disputed. Some people will put it as early as 2,500. I think Brian McVeigh will put it at 600 BC. Okay, so it's a disputed date, but let's just stick with the 2,500 for the moment. We begin to see the decline in bicamerality, and we begin to see the emerging of consciousness. Okay, so again, we have a time of stresses where we are, again, you know, there's societal change, there's environmental collapses and things going on.
The rise in violence?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things going on that people are having. Again, it's new stuff they're not used to dealing with. You know, how do you deal with the fact that you're meeting so many other people with all these other bicameral instructions that are differing from the one you're getting, and this great upheaval that takes place as a result of this. So consciousness begins to evolve in a kind of a way, and it's influenced, Jaynes says, by factors like writing and cultural exchange. And then by the time we hit 0 AD, we are pretty much fully conscious. We have vestiges of the bicameral mind. There are still people around who are hearing voices, but less and less that is occurring. So let's just throw this one at you. The voices entered Jaynes' theory of consciousness as auditory, verbal hallucinations experienced during moments of stressful indecision. A response to the need for a new kind of social control as people moved away from small hunter-gatherer bands to larger agricultural-based societies. Okay. So in The Origin of Consciousness, Jaynes attributes the decline of bicamerality and its replacements by subjectivity in Greece and the Near East to several causes. So these include the fundamental instability of bicameral kingdoms, which were based on a strict hierarchy, which might easily be shaken by novel situations, such as increasing contact with other peoples who follow different God voices. The spread of literacy would have been another factor working against bicamerality, as writing would have reduced the dependence on hallucinated voices for guidance. and then the chaotic conditions prevailing in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East after the eruption of the Thera volcano and the so-called Dorian invasions may have contributed to a situation in which bicamerality collapsed suddenly and traumatically across the whole region. So that idea of a great crisis is very important to Jaynes' sense of development of things. Okay, some illustrations. If you read anything by Jaynes or by anybody who's writing about Jaynes, they will tell you about Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. It's like almost every chapter of that book that I read talked about the Iliad and the Odyssey. And basically they say, in the Iliad, human beings are not conscious at all. And what they're saying is you have a picture of someone who is going along, they might be at war, doing their thing. They hear a voice, they follow the instruction. It's as simple as that. And that's the kind of level of interaction you see in the Iliad. They hear a voice, they follow an instruction. Whereas in the Odyssey, when a novel situation comes up, we have someone who starts introspecting. They start thinking about, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to handle this situation? They start talking about things like, oh, I've injured myself, I'm suffering, you know, why is this going on? So there's a very different way of approaching the world and processing what the world is doing. And now Jaynes also talks about biblical imagery and biblical stories as well. And for me, the character that illustrates the bicameral mind more than any other is Abraham. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Abraham, but if you read any of it, basically Abraham hears something from God and he goes and does it. There's no question of, should I really be doing this? Is it the right thing to do? What's going to happen if I do it? God says, Abraham does. And even to the point of this story that I've got here, which is Genesis 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, even in that story, you know, for us, we hear a voice that tells us to sacrifice our son. You can imagine what would go on. It doesn't happen in Abraham's mind at all. God says, Abraham does. Okay, so that for me really illustrates bicamerality very well. But then towards the end of the Old Testament, Jaynes quotes the prophet of Amos and these words, "Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread nor of thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea and from north to east. They shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but shall not find it." And for Jaynes, that is indicative of the gradual failing of this God voice, so that it is being replaced by conscious introspection. All right, I'm going to stop for questions before I go any further. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, I see the bicameral mind as the will and the understanding. And because they are in conflict with one another, a conversation ensues. Will I steal the car or will I not steal the car? And then a conversation ensues and a decision is made from that conversation, depending on which is stronger, the will or the understanding.
Yeah,
and that's how I see the two hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah, so that's very much the modern conscious way of approaching that problem, isn't it? We have that conversation with ourselves. What Jaynes says that is in that bicameral era, it wouldn't be experienced as a conversation, it would be experienced as the will voice makes its will known to the understanding and the understanding merely carries it out. And so the breakdown of the bicameral mind, the emerging of consciousness, is what you've just described. It's a process that we sense going on within us. Okay?
I'll just mention something. You have stories, say, of the Australian Aborigines talking about the Wandjina coming and teaching them things. And, you know, sometimes the Aborigines know how to deal with poisonous foods, like making flour from cycad seeds, which have got a lot of cyanide in it, and they know that they need to have the seeds placed in flowing water and for the toxins to be removed for about a week. And then they can use the substance to make flour. And there are other examples of Indigenous people saying that they were taught what herbs were very useful for medicinal purposes. So that came to mind when you were talking about how voices were coming and, in a sense, teaching the early people what to do. So that's an example that seems to be supportive of Jaynes's understanding of what happened to our ancestors.
Yeah. And then you've got the question of where did the voices actually come from? Are they being generated by the brain, or are they coming in from somewhere else? And this is where I'll lead on to how we then talk about Jaynes and Swedenborg and the interaction of their philosophies. So if we were to look at Swedenborg from Jaynes' perspective, what do you think Julian Jaynes' diagnosis of Swedenborg would be? What would it be his perspective on Swedenborg?
Oh, he could think it's hocus pocus.
He would, and what he would say is what he would say is that what Swedenborg is experiencing is a vestige of the bicameral mind. Plain and simple.
That's a way of rationalising something that may well not be true at all.
Yeah. So this is where
it really prevails in the end.
Yeah, and this is where I said earlier, hang on to the idea that Jaynes is a materialistic philosophy, because you can. There's no sense of the spiritual whatsoever, and that's how he would explain it.
He would have said that Swedenborg was hallucinating.
Yes, it would. That's in his terms of what hallucination is. Yes, that's right. So it becomes pretty simple of that side of the question, So to ask what would Jaynes think of Swedenborg, there would be that, and you wouldn't get any further. But what I'm interested in is, what does Swedenborg think of Jaynes, and how can we look at Jaynes from a Swedenborgian point of view? And I find that question very interesting. First of all, how would Swedenborg disagree with Jaynes?
He would say that he's influenced by the influx of evil spirits, telling him to deny God and look for a rational explanation from this world, and so, in other words, leave God out of the equation. That's what he would tell him.
Yeah.
Well, it might be useful to talk about the fact that part of the sources of Jaynes' thinking came from the fact that he worked with schizophrenics, and that therefore, and it was the voices that the schizophrenics heard that he equated to that voices that were heard during the period of the bicameral mind.
Yeah. Leo, you mentioned influx of evil spirits. Influx is an incredibly important concept in Swedenborg's work, and I think it's one of the fundamental disagreements he would have with Jaynes. So Jaynes talks about language as being kind of the source of the source of consciousness, whereas Swedenborg would say, what did I write here? Well, Swedenborg would talk about the doctrine of influx. So things occur on the spiritual first, and then they come into being on the natural, not the other way around. Jaynes is working backwards in Swedenborg's philosophy.
That's why it's so hard to understand. You've got to sort of reverse everything about your thinking concept to get into what he's on about.
Yeah, it's a different way round of thinking. But, so bear that in mind. But there are some interesting agreements as well. And I just want to focus on three things that I find really interesting reading Jaynes' work. The first is what Swedenborg calls proprium. You think about what Swedenborg says about this proprium, as in it is an appearance of self, self-consciousness, the appearance of independent thought, of agency and self-reflection. Now, Swedenborg says it's an appearance. Jaynes also says it's an appearance. Here's some things that Swedenborg writes. Countless things can be said about the proprium. Think self-consciousness. With the bodily minded and worldly man, the proprium is his all. He is unaware of anything else but the proprium. And as has been stated, if he were to lose his proprium, he would think that he was dying. Another longer one for you. So this is talking about the story in Genesis chapter 2 of the creation of woman. So he writes, I'm going to start from a rib. A rib, which is a breastbone, is used to mean man's proprium when it contains very little life, a proprium indeed that he cherishes. A deep sleep is used to mean that state into which he was brought so that he might seem to himself to have a proprium. This state resembles sleep because a person in that state is conscious only of living, thinking, speaking and acting from himself. But when he starts to realise that this is false, he is aroused from sleep, so to speak, and wakes up. So it's interesting that there's this correlation between these two ideas of Jaynes' idea of self-consciousness, Swedenborg's idea of proprium, and what Swedenborg would say is, as I think you've hinted at, Leo, Jaynes is actually asleep. Second thing that I note is correspondences. So for Jaynes, metaphor is at the root of language, and Swedenborg's idea of correspondences is throughout his writing. So the symbolic language with which the Spirit speaks. So this is Jaynes says that metaphor is not a mere extra trick of language, it is the very constructive ground of language. And then this again is referring to the Iliad. It says psyche means breath in the Iliad, that's in the bicameral stage. Means breath, not soul or conscious mind, which it comes to mean in consciousness. Thumos means motion or agitation of the limbs, not emotional sensibility. And nous means simple perception, not the imaginal mind. So as we've moved into consciousness, we've given these words metaphorical meaning. So I look at Jaynes and I see here we have support for Swedenborg's whole idea of correspondence, which most people find quite difficult to understand. It's built into our language, and it's a really useful way for us to start to grasp what correspondence is. Third thing I want to mention is spiritual history. So I want to compare Swedenborg's history of the churches with Jaynes's spiritual history. Here's what I showed you from Jaynes. Here's how it tallies with Swedenborg. So Swedenborg would call that early part from 200,000 BC the most ancient church. And if you go looking at Arcana Celestia, he talks about people living in small family groups, they're hunter-gatherers, you know, there's not much interaction amongst people. So it ties in very well with that era. Then obviously there's that late section, which is a later most ancient church. He talks about the character, I think, of Enoch it is, who gathers correspondences, and I would put him probably in that 40,000 BC sort of era, I think. That would be my guess. Then from 9,000, I'd talk about what Swedenborg calls the ancient church. And it's at this point where we see things like idols appearing. And people are starting to create physical effigies of correspondential and spiritual realities. And for Jaynes, these things become like the triggers for the bicameral voices. Okay, so there's a very interesting tie in there.
So that's like saying every man becomes a representative church.
Yes.
As soon as
Yeah.
he creates the icons, that's what he's done.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we move on to 2005.
Can I just say something, please?
Yes, Heather.
Did you say that you're going to put Enoch in about the 40,000 year BC?
I'm guessing.
Was it
on
Enoch?
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's just that when you look up dates about, when Abraham was and then Moses and then Adam and Eve, well, Adam and Eve only go back 7,000 years.
Okay, it depends who you date, what dates you're looking at, I suppose. Yeah, I'm not myself a massive historian, Heather, that's all I can say. All I can do really is rely on scholars, and it depends, I think, on which scholar you read, possibly. I can't give you a better answer than that, I'm afraid. What I will say is Abraham, we certainly put Abraham towards the beginning of this section, the 2500 BC era. So with Abraham and the beginning of the Israelitish church, we see this decline of the bicameral mind and the emerging of consciousness. So really, Jaynes looks at the Old Testament basically as a record of the decline of the bicameral mind. And then, of course, by the time we get to Jesus Christ, 0 AD, we are fully conscious. There are vestiges of the bicameral mind about, but basically people are operating in a conscious way. Now, the question then is, what do we do with the new church? Because Swedenborg talks about 5 eras of spiritual history. Most ancient church, Israelitish, Christian, and then this new era he calls the new church. And what do we think about that? Well, I'm going to show you, I'm going to now dive back into my video that I mentioned before and just show you a clip of this. It's only about 3 minutes long.
It's really common sense if we think about it. If once a population starts to reach a certain size, it starts to stress the environment. It stresses the social political fabric. It stresses technology. If you don't have the technology to keep up with the expansion of population, you're going to have problems. And basically, the way I read Jaynes in his book is that is really the key variable here, I think, is population. And then that leads to the issue that I talked about in my book about the Bible, communications. Mm-hmm. How can we communicate? And I view the mind and society as being mirrors of each other. So whatever happens in society has to be reorganized. The mind has to reorganize itself to adapt to those changes. And sometimes the mind can't keep up. So in any case, yes, to go back to what you said, I think population density is probably the key variable in explaining why we've had transitions in mentality.
So the bicameral mind was just no longer an adaptive advantage when you needed to work with people that you didn't really know. And
well, it just sounds so chaotic. Everybody's hearing voices. Presumably, those voices aren't all saying the same thing. And as there get to be larger and larger populations, you have to have this kind of cohesive action.
Oh, so this makes me think that there's a similar issue occurring on Earth right now, where humans are more linked up than ever before. So in a sense, socially, you have the internet now for the first time, and humans can interact with thousands of people and sort of know, if you want to say know, thousands of people, at least in some acquaintance fashion. Wonder what sort of psychological adaptations will follow.
Well, I do too. And, actually, when Jaynes was still alive years ago, somebody asked him that, what is the future of conscious interiority? What type of form will it take? And he basically said, well, I'm not going to venture there because it's such a big question.
Aw.
But I certainly think it's something worth entertaining. I mean, I think the changes, even the past 20, 30 years, there have been some subtle changes, I think. I mean, nothing as massive as the collapse of bicameral mentality, but certainly a lot of subtle changes in how we process information, how we prioritize information, how we relate to other people. And it may take another century or two, actually, to see bigger changes in human consciousness. I certainly think, I think we're on our way, actually.
Well, there's something really interesting about the internet and all these platforms that people are using.
So yeah, look, I just found that comment really interesting in terms of Swedenborg's sense of spiritual history and the future development. You know, what's going to happen in the future? Are we at one of these kind of watershed times where we're going to see a new emerging form of consciousness in some way? I clearly have no answers about it, but all I can say is Swedenborg points to a calamitous change taking place. Swedenborg talks about a spiritual cause to it, not a natural cause, but still there is that shift that is potentially taking place. So I just find that a very, very interesting observation that's being made there. So those were my three things, was proprium, correspondences and spiritual history, and there may well be others. I'm certainly not trying to be exhaustive tonight, but I certainly would encourage anybody to, if you feel like it, go and grab yourself a copy of this book and have a read, borrow mine if you want, as long as you give it back to me. Fascinating stuff to read from the point of view of Swedenborg. I am going to stop now and open it up to any questions anybody has.
There was a time when it would not have been a bicameral mind, when man was in order, because man was at one stage did not have a conscience because he was in order, so he never required a conscience. But when the incident happened, which we know as the fall of man, God actually gifted man with a conscience. So that means you have this side and that side going. Will I steal the car? Will I not steal the car? So, because man was going to go straight to hell, there was no getting out of it. So the conscience was the method that he could be saved, because now it put him in a state of freedom where he could juggle the two sides and come to his own decision.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this probably linked somehow with the bicameral mind, but because he probably wasn't knowledgeable in Swedenborg, he couldn't really put his finger on the way it was actually operating.
It's interesting, you know, I didn't mention it, but Swedenborg's use of, Jaynes's use of the terms perception and conscience is quite interesting. So one of the things Swedenborg will say about the most ancient church is they had perception. Okay? They saw what was true and what was good. They didn't need to think about it, they just saw it. As the most ancient church declined, there was this falling away, and that at that point, yes, we needed conscience, as you're saying. So, and one of the things Jaynes says is conscience is the voice of God. And Swedenborg says almost exactly the same thing. So it's just another correlation between the two works. Yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting observation, perception and conscience, these two. Michael, you were going to say something, I think.
Yes, you mentioned that Swedenborg talked about a calamitous change that's associated with the new church. Can you expand on that? Because that's unfamiliar to me.
Well, the calamitous changes Swedenborg talks about, of course, all originate in the spiritual. That's the first thing to hang on to. And so everything that occurs in the world physically occurs because of a cause which is at higher level, spiritual level. So for Swedenborg, the calamitous change really is the spiritual one. And he talks about, you know, witnessing what he calls the last judgment in the spiritual world, which then brings about a reordering which then brings about changes in the natural world. Jaynes looks at it the other way around. Jaynes looks at the natural calamities and things and says, well, bicamerality, the decline in bicamerality is caused by these natural events. So he sees it the other way around. But for Swedenborg, the cause is always in the spiritual. And so he talks, so where Swedenborg says the last judgment and talks about the end of the Christian church in those and the spiritual causes, that then has ramifications for our continued development on this planet. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yes, it does. I didn't realise that the Last Judgment, as he describes it, happening, I think, in 1757, was calamitous. But certainly it was the initiation of big changes on the terrestrial level.
I think the potential for it to be calamitous on the physical level is potentially quite high. I hope we get through these changes without too much collateral damage. But we're kind of pretty stupid. We tend to not make changes until the very last minute. When something goes wrong, we tend to keep doing them going wrong until we can't back out of the changes. That tends to be our habit. So the potential for us to have a naturally calamitous event which becomes part of this process, which began in 1757, it's there. And for Swedenborg, I think it doesn't need to happen, but the possibility is there if we're not switched on enough. But I think ultimately the end result will be we will be more switched on, we will be more spiritually developed than we currently are. That's my understanding.
I was thinking these calamitous changes that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, they sort of, are they something that will happen or very likely to happen?
So the way I always put it is the spiritual realities that they represent must happen. Whether they occur on a natural level, that's up for grabs. And I think it depends very much upon how quickly we pick up on the spiritual intent and momentum. So if we are able to head off a problem at a spiritual level, if we're able to deal with an issue at a spiritual level, then we don't need to suffer the physical consequences of it, or not so heavily. But if we were to, just completely ignore the spiritual issue, and just get on with our natural lives, which is a high possibility at least, then we're going to start to feel some of those calamities. Now, they may not look like the way they're described by the Apostle John in the book of Revelation, but there's the possibility of calamity taking place.
Well, thanks for that.
That's my thinking on it. But spiritually, they must happen. Naturally, that depends on how we react to the spiritual.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Heather?
I've got a comment, but not a question.
Yeah.
I just want to sort of say, like in Amos 8, 11, 12, you mentioned that he's saying that there's a famine of God not hearing his voice. Well, I certainly believe that, but I just want to bring it up in Kabbalah. I think that was in the 10th century, and I can't even pronounce the guy's name who was in a cave and got the Zohar, but he certainly heard God's voice. There was Muhammad, I know he's a different religion, then you got Swedenborg, and then you got Joseph Smith with the Mormons, and they're all saying different things. They're not, you know, even tying it in, sort of thing, with how we know the Bible, sort of thing.
Swedenborg is definitive.
I didn't catch what he said.
Swedenborg is definitive.
Swedenborg is definitive.
He talks directly to the rational mind.
Yeah. So Jaynes, of course, would look at all of those people and say it's a vestige of the bicameral mind. Okay, that would be his explanation for all of those. Swedenborg's interesting in that he looks at other spiritual authors and other prophets, we might call them, and he says that their writing is accommodated for the people to whom they wrote. So there's, you know, he looks at Joseph Smith, although Joseph Smith is after Swedenborg, but he would say the same thing. He looks at Muhammad. He mentions Muhammad in actual fact. And the prophets in general, the biblical prophets too, as writing in a way which is accommodated to the understanding of the people who were going to read the work. So, you know, the Jewish prophets are written to a Jewish mentality. So that explains the difference very often in the external writing of, say, Muhammad to the Old Testament prophets, or, you know, Joseph Smith to Swedenborg. It's accommodated to the person and the people to whom it's written. Any other questions?
The story of Jill Bolte Taylor, who is a brain specialist. In a sense, she understands the workings of the brain really well. And she had an aneurysm in the left hemisphere of her brain, and it knocked it out. And she knew what was happening and needed help. And she eventually got help, but it was her right hemisphere was what was operating, while the left hemisphere was inoperative. And she found that she could see things in unity, totally different to how she lived before. And in a sense, this would be an example of consciousness showing itself compared to awareness before this brain injury occurred. And so it would be interesting to see what Jaynes would have to say about the experience of Jill Bolte Taylor, because I'm thinking she might have had this after he passed on. But anyway, that's to me, her experience shows the primacy of the right hemisphere as in a sense needing to, or I would imagine, would be where the conscience is situated. It needs to guide the lesser mentality of awareness as to what to do.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating other book that's worth reading if you get the chance is Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. He'll talk about those sorts of experience. I don't think he names that particular person, but he certainly talks about the way the brain can compensate for loss of function in certain areas. Plasticity, yes. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating book. I read it from the point of view as a piano teacher, and I just found it so enlightening. So it's well worth having a look at too.
What's the name of it again? I'll write it down.
So the author is Norman Doidge, Doidge, and it's called The Brain That Changes Itself.
Okay. That sounds good.
Really, really fascinating stuff. It's up there with like of Oliver Sacks. If you read Oliver Sacks' stuff on mental health, mental issues, it's fascinating. Well worth a read.
Well, I've heard Norman Doidge talk in podcasts, and it's excellent, the things he has to say.
Yeah, it is very good. It's very good. Well, look, if there's no other questions, anybody last minute chance to say anything? Rowan?
Do you think Jesus had to deal with putting away the bicameral mind? Because I know when he was a young boy in the temple, he was listening to his father asking him to stay in the temple or something like that. My father belongs here.
Yes, okay.
So was there a part where he was just listening to instructions coming in?
So did everybody hear Rowan's comment there?
No, nothing.
No, that's fine, because he's sitting quite far away. So he's talking about the relationship of Jesus to the bicameral mind, which is quite an interesting one to consider. What do you think? Yeah, what do you think of Jesus? What would Jaynes think of Jesus? Martin?
Well, I think that Rowan brings up an interesting point, which is that the bicameral mind not only happened historically, but it also happens in human development. And you can see this when you deal with children. The younger they are, the more that they are responding, not so much from a sense of self, but from a
Here we go.
Somehow, it's what their understanding can be seen to be flowing through them to the people around them, and I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. Children, you only have to watch YouTube videos on children to see the most amazing things that they say, and I think that this is true. And Jesus came to earth for the specific purpose of going through the development process that human beings have to undergo. That was part of his mission, to do that. And so, what I think that Rowan has pointed out is that there's patterns within patterns, not just patterns of a generalised nature as in history and as in the world, but patterns in very specific. I think even in our own lives, and even in our own moments, we may actually undertake a certain degree of bicamerality, or the absence of it.
Look, there's lots to ponder. As I say, I've really bombarded you with a lot of stuff today, so well done for making it through. I find it absolutely fascinating. I say that book is well worth reading. Martin has got me onto, I need to read The Origin of Consciousness, the original, because he thinks there's some different things that are not picked up by some of the authors that comment on Jaynes, so that's something that I'll be doing. But look, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been good to have you here.
Thanks, that was really good. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thanks, James. It's been good to have you here. And as I mentioned, 28th of February, pop it in your diary. We'll be back here. It'll be on YouTube on that particular occasion, but you are most welcome to join us here face to face as well. If you're on our mailing list, we'll let you know about it. Okay?
Thanks, David. I enjoyed your talk, and I thought you gave a very good coverage of the topic.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Look, I wish you all a good evening and have a Merry Christmas too. We'll look forward to seeing you in the new year.